Hi, you're listening to Face the Sun. My name is Gaia, and I'm your host. Welcome to a show where I discuss matters of religion, belief, and unbelief. For this week's episode, I have on as my guest, Liza Arulampalam. She is the pastor of a church called Riverfront Family Church, and that's in Hartford. Given COVID, they've done remote church, but now they're getting back together again, outside church for now as they prepare for their future ventures. What I found in my podcast time is that people on Facebook, people that I meet on social media, and people that I meet around the state that I live in will talk about this church. They keep talking about it. I am very grateful that I got a chance to connect with Liza. What we do is that we talk about women in the church. We touch on that. We also talk about what she calls decolonizing Christianity. And I appreciate her so much. And her perspective is so eye-opening, where I have not thought about Christianity or Jesus followers in this way ever, ever, ever. So I'm grateful that I had that time to talk with her. We also talked about the history of her church, of how it got started, where it is today, and her thoughts about that. So I hope that you enjoy this episode. I would love to hear what your thoughts are on Pastor Liza's experiences and her perceptions. I really would like to hear more about what you think. I will give links to her church and contact information for her and those in her church in the descriptions below. Okay, on with the show. And I also so some of the things we also talked about, which we can chat, not just the church. I do want to hear what you had said about the history and where it started and where it's going, but also you talked about in the email I have here of the idea of decolonizing our Christianity. Yeah. And we had a conversation about that. And then also women in the church. That's something I'm definitely going to be probably drilling on for this year, because so the church that I had mentioned that was talking about complementarian, and really holding firm to that. I'm going to be having like that book that I talked to you about before. And then the other one with the Rachel Held Evans one, Faith Unraveled.
Yes, I love her. She just released a children's book that I really want to get. She started writing it like in the month before she died, and then somebody finished it. And it's called What Is God Like or something. And it's like, God is like this, and it's so beautiful and like so inclusive. I need to get it for my kids. But if you have any like gifts for children, you need to check it out.
I might have seen it too flash up, and I was like, I thought that she had passed away. So interesting.
It was like her last project right before she died, because she had two children, like when she died, a baby and like a 2-year-old or something. So she had just started it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
For the one that I was going to do on the making of biblical womanhood, it's where she really goes after complementarian versus egalitarian, and the complementarian she calls rightfully patriarchy. Yes. And so I'd love to talk about that in regards to the church too.
Because there's a price to pay when you speak up. Like that kind of culture demands a sacrifice, and it's not without a price that people speak out against, about the subjugation that they're experiencing.
What do you think the price is?
I mean, I think if they're part of that community, it's being shunned from the community, whether that mean like actually being kicked out of the community or just losing your people, not viewing you the same way, like viewing you as inferior. And women face that. Like Aruna and I talk about this a lot, because when we were in college, we were part of InterVarsity, which is a pretty conservative parachurch organization on college campuses. That's actually how we met. And they held complementarian viewpoints for the most part. I don't know if the organization necessarily had like a stance, but all the people did. And I never, ever, Arunan grew up that way. Like that was what he was taught, and probably what he thought for a little while until he was maybe like 19, 20, whatever. I didn't. My mom was a minister, right? And I grew up in a UCC church in Connecticut. So I was like, what is this? And I remember I was in a relationship with a guy my freshman year who was like, oh, I'm the spiritual leader in the relationship. I was like, okay, what? Like, I was trying to work it all out. And
you're like, check, please.
Yeah. And Arunan eventually then did also believe in egalitarianism, and also same thing with LGBT inclusion. But what he faced from the community and what I face as a woman, like, people always want to blame women for speaking out on this. And I think sometimes, like, it's better to get the men to speak about it. Just like how as white people, it's like it's our job to do the work that, like, we've created. I feel like with patriarchy, it's the same. Like, we shouldn't always expect women to have to be the ones to speak on it, because, like, we're so close to the problem, and we don't always have the language to talk about things that we've experienced with patriarchy, both in the church and outside of. And so I feel like men need to do some of that work and learn how to speak about that and learn how to advocate. Just like how I would say with race too, like, we can't always look to Black and brown people to have to, like, do all that educating and all that work, because they've been victims of that and they're dealing with that. And so it's our job, like, it's our problem as white people. We created white supremacy. We have to dismantle it. It's the same with patriarchy. Like, it was not created by us. It was created by men. So, like, they need to do the work in dismantling. And the price that women pay for speaking out is a steeper price in terms of how they're dealt with in the community, and how they are blamed for that, right? Like, I imagine that she would be blamed, not her husband, even if they both held the same viewpoint.
Yeah. I do think that men might listen to other men better, which is a shame, but that's why we're in the situation we're in.
Right. Right.
So, but I also think that in churches, piss off the women and you're going to have a big problem on your hands, because women do so much. They're a bigger membership, as far as I understand, is that there's more women in churches than men.
In almost all churches. Yeah. Our church is like 65% women, 35-40% men. And that's pretty typical.
Yeah. And
because single women go to church and single men often don't. Some do. Yeah. Some do. And we have a lot of same female. We have like probably 5 or 6 lesbian couples in our church too, which skews the numbers. So we have like couples, but we have like only one male couple. Yeah. So yeah, we have a lot more women for sure.
And the women, I think, would be jumping in on certain things to take care of helping to organize and gather.
Well, I think that's why authoritarianism is used in the Western American, and I specifically American, like, this is not true of all Christian cultures, but in our American Christian culture, our churches, many of them, especially the more conservative ones, have a very authoritarian bent, and it's a means by which people are controlled, and you are punished for speaking out and stepping out, because they know if people came together and it became power with as opposed to power over, then that would threaten their authority, the male pastors' authority.
And what I think when you say the punish too, this reminds me of the conversation we had when we were at meeting up for coffee, is that what Americans think of as persecution is so different than what really is happening around the world.
Oh, completely. Yeah.
And so people say, well, I'm afraid to speak out because I might be punished, or I'm afraid to speak out because of the consequence. It's like, well, what are the consequences? Because they're not going to be punched in the face. It's just like,
no, it's community within that Christian subculture. The consequences are community shaming or shunning or being outside of community, being treated as differently. It's not necessarily like physical consequences. But I mean, there are examples too, like what's the guy? Oh, I'm blanking his name out, but there's this megachurch pastor. He's been like the most toxic megachurch pastor. It's Mark Driscoll. Mark Driscoll? There's been like all kinds of.
I heard something about him. Is he still a pastor or no?
Yes, he left one church. There's just been but he's like a huge complementarianism, like really patriarchal in his theology and gender. And most recently, abusive. Most recently, there was like this scandal where his daughter, some guy was like another teenager was like interested in his teenage daughter, and he like stalked him, got like all these people in the church to like follow his family, like park cars outside of his house and intimidate him. And it just became this like toxic authoritarian thing. Wow. And so like that's what I mean by punish. Like that's a super, super extreme example. Like the more subtle examples would be like, oh, well, God has endowed me to like follow me as I follow Jesus, right? Like there's subtle examples of like how authoritarianism is exerted in the church. That's an extreme example, but the punishment is social, not for the most part, like physical, but that doesn't make it any less toxic or effed up.
I wonder though if that's because we're so thin-skinned that we can't take a little bit of social discomfort. Like, do we just? I don't know. I mean, what you're talking about with what Mark Driscoll did is very scary and sounds illegal and very oppressive. But but what like say in the Northeast, if people are like they don't like that you just said women should be equal to men and it shouldn't be separate but equal, it should really be that women have the same place, and that'll make people not feel uncomfortable. So we just like to stay away from it. I wonder what I don't know. It doesn't seem like that would be that. I mean, this is coming from somebody who left the church and was pushing against a lot of things before I left the church, but I still,
yeah.
I mean, you don't lose your job, not in the Northeast, really, where
unless you work for the church. And I think that's why a lot of pastors don't speak up about a whole bunch of things, because I mean, the LGBT issue, like that's the case for a lot of churches too. Like I know from like firsthand that there are lots of conservative church pastors who are open and affirming. Like I know of a few who will not speak up on it because they will lose their job or it will split the church. And I mean, we can judge them and say like, well, you have more courage, but I mean, people are complex, right? And there's a whole bunch of factors in that. It's interesting though, because that segues too to like the story of my mom. Like when you said that women leaving the church impacts the church, like that's the whole reason that my mom left the more conservative churches was because of gender. I mean, among other issues too, but our whole family left the church because my mom wasn't able to hold leadership positions and she felt called to ministry. And so that's a great example of like what you were saying of women. I mean, we're in some families, right? Every family dynamic is different, but we left the Christian Missionary Alliance Church because of a series of conversations that she had with the minister where he was basically like, well, you can teach Sunday school and you can teach Sunday school. And, oh yeah, you can teach Sunday school. She was like, okay, but I feel called to more. And our family left because of that. I think that probably happens less frequently than I would hope, but I mean, that's how our church was born. So it happens sometimes.
I wonder when you look at our grandparents, how things were then, seeing things have changed over the many decades, right? From what we know about, from what our grandparents have told us, or we've experienced from our parents or ourselves, and then looking to a younger generation who are coming up. I wonder if there's going to be more of a push in regards to women and LGBTQ, and if there's going to be. Do you have any sense of that people, especially now with the pandemic? I guess it's hard to get your finger on the pulse because of the pandemic, but I'm wondering if things are going to be different, if people are going to feel like this isn't fitting, if you're not going to treat women with respect.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's definitely progress. Like there's that quotation, who said it, Martin Luther King, that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. And I feel like the church is like a lot of other things in our society where it's like one step forward, a couple steps back, and then there's a backlash, right? Like you see that in culture too. And the church is no different. The church moves slower than culture, I think, in my experience. I mean, women in most denominations weren't even able to be ordained at all, even the liberal mainline denominations, until like, the 70s or 80s for the most part, with some exceptions. And so we're talking about like, I mean, that was when my mom was in like, she graduated high school in 1976. And so like that was in her generation, like she was seeing that for the very, very first time among some denominations. And so she always felt a call to ministry and didn't go into ministry because that was not something that women did in 1984 or 2, whenever she graduated from. I mean, it was, but it was rare. And I think that has shifted and changed. It's so much more normalized now. Like in my class at Yale, it was probably more women than men being ordained, or at least
Good.
equal. But again, that's among the UCC and the Episcopals and the Methodists and the PCUSA folks, and a lot of it's very denominational as well. So I think there is movement, and I think there's certainly movement on the LGBTQ side too. Like, you do see more churches becoming open and affirming. You do see denominational shifts for sure. It's slower than I would like, but I'm hopeful. I think it's just how much damage is going to be done before we move towards a sense of true collective liberation in the church. And I feel like that's so much of my job, is just healing a lot of that damage that has been done. And so it's like, it's slow progress. And I as a pastor would like to see it happen quickly, because there's so much bad fruit being produced from the oppression of the interlocking oppressions of women, LGBT folks.
Yeah, because there's
others as well.
There's all this carnage, around you because of slow moving churches. Yeah. And you've said that people come to you pretty broken and bruised and bleeding, and it's just happening all around. And if you could stop the bleeding, that'd be a great step in the right direction. It seems like some churches have this smoke and mirrors type of thing where they're so cool and liberal, they're so hip, they're so whatever, and then they're really not. Where we talk about open and affirming, but some who the phrase I hear a lot is skinny jeans. The pastors with the skinny jeans and the light show that they do.
We call them seeker friendly churches. That in church lingo.
So they seek people and then kind of reject them in the end when they let them know where they really stand, is like, because they're not really open. They do a lot of it sounds like they do a lot of mental gymnastics as far as not saying that they don't accept people, or they won't allow for women in leadership, or they won't allow for LGBTQ to become members or take any leadership roles, but they work, they do all these gymnastics to make sure that they don't say it. Is that's something that seems to be?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, back in the 70s, 80s, probably even 90s, it was okay and accepted for churches to just be clear about their stance, because culture was incredibly homophobic. And I mean, even, when I think about when I was in high school, like within the first half of my lifetime, and now, depending on, obviously it's regional and it varies from place to place, but like we've talked about, culture around LGBTQ inclusion has shifted across the whole country. More Americans support that culturally. And so churches that are trying to be seeker friendly and are trying to integrate with culture and are trying to attract non-Christians and folks who, like you mentioned, the skinny jeans, smoke machines, they do a lot of things to attract people and see and bring them to church. Having like a big poster saying that you don't accept gay people is not going to bring, and there are churches that do that, but those aren't the big ones, because that's a turnoff to people culturally. And so they've gotten a lot more insidious in how they've done it. And you'd be hard pressed to find people's policy on same-sex marriage, same-sex attraction, whatever you want to call it. Usually it's like the theology of human sexuality or whatever it might be. You'd be hard pressed to find that on the websites or published material of a lot of the really like hip churches. But that doesn't mean that they have good theology around it. That doesn't mean that they are open and affirming. It just means that they want to bring people in. And then depending on what kind of leadership positions you want to take, maybe you want to preach, maybe you want to lead worship, maybe you want to teach children. I mean, it varies from church to church, or maybe you meet somebody and you want to have your minister marry you. And then they tell you, oh, I'm sorry, I can't marry you because I actually don't believe in this theology of human sexuality that you do. That is so much more damaging. It's a bait and switch, right? And so I think that's a great example of how oppression, and this is true not just with LGBTQ stuff, but like oppression is so sneaky, and it finds ways to creep in, and it just it looks different and it shifts, but it's still there. It's still always there. So we have to keep fighting for that collective liberation for all people across all, kinds of different people in the church and outside of it.
And I'm looking at our notes and going backwards and thinking how your church maybe we can talk now about the history and the founding of your church and how that kind of is different than the traditional conservative and the seeker places. Mm-hmm. Where have you come from?
Sure. So our church, Riverfront Family Church, which is in Hartford, was founded by my mom. Her name was Nancy Butler. She died 5 years ago from ALS, and she went to evangelical churches until I was probably in about third grade. So she would have been probably close to my age, a little older, late 30s. And ultimately, we went to a Christian Missionary Alliance church when I was growing up and had a lot of issues with the social values around LGBTQ, around women, and also around theology of other religions. I think her tipping point was we lived in the DC area, and my sister was 3 or 4 at the time, and we were in a grocery store. And she saw a sick man with a turban. He was a practitioner of the Sikh religion. And she started crying and she was afraid of him. And my mom said, "Why are you crying?" And she said, "Well, we learned in Sunday school that those people kill Christians." And I think we had learned some missionary story from India. And my mom was like, "That's it. Like, I cannot raise my 2 daughters in this kind of environment." Although there were so many things that she loved about it too. She loved how seriously they took the Bible. She loved the sense of community. She loved contemporary worship music. She loved their, just commitment, full life commitment to following and seeking after God. But ultimately, it wasn't worth it for all the social values that we were being taught. So she left. We moved to a Methodist church. And then when we moved to Connecticut, a few years later, we joined a UCC church because it's New England and there's like 3 UCC churches in every town. So many Congregationalists. So we kind of moved more and more liberal, more and more mainline as I was growing up. And there's things that my mom just loved about the UCC. The UCC was one of the very first denominations to really fully affirm the full personhood of LGBT people, do gay marriages, all of those kind of things. And UCC is so committed to social justice work. She loved a lot of things about our church, but there were so many things that she deeply missed from her time in the evangelical church world, charismatic, non-denominational world. And she had her background in marketing. She was working for an insurance company doing marketing. It was in the year 2000. I was in 8th grade at the time. She decided to leave marketing and go to seminary. She was 40 years old. And in true interfaith fashion, I remember she said, "Well, that's the same year that the Prophet Muhammad got his vision. So it's not too late when you're 40 years old." She went to seminary. She went to Yale Divinity School, with a 4th grader and an 8th grader at home, and got her MDiv and decided to start a new church that combined, in her mind, what was the best of the mainline church culture and the charismatic evangelical church culture. And that's how Riverfront was born. It was in the year 2008. So it took her 8 years to get her degree, get a planting team together, all of that. And she was doing it part-time because she was also the primary caregiver of my sister and of me. And she started Riverfront in 2008. So we are, 13 years old now at this point. And we've morphed and changed a lot over the years. We've been in a couple different locations. She got sick with ALS in 2014, 2015, and I took over along with 2 other co-pastors running the church when she got too sick to do it. But we were really birthed out of that desire to minister to people who had been hurt and harmed by the church, and to really be a place of healing and welcome and openness to all kinds of people. And we have all kinds of Riverfronters in our church, but especially to people who grew up in charismatic and evangelical churches and were excluded from that for some reason, or maybe a loved one was. We have a lot of folks who, like a brother or a close friend, had something happen to them. Mm-hmm. But so we've changed a lot, but I think we continue to be that kind of place of healing for folks.
That's an amazing story.
Yeah.
So you did it when your mother passed, you and 2 others became.
Yeah. So when she was sick, so she got diagnosed with ALS in 2000, the very early part of 2015. It was like February of 2015. And ALS is I don't know if you're familiar with it at all, but it's a very quick decline. Most people live 2 to 5 years after diagnosis. So she knew that she wouldn't be able to lead the church for much longer. So we started thinking about transition planning, which was hard because she was the founding pastor. So it was very much, I don't know if I want to use the word personality cult, but it was very centered around the personality of my mom, and she never took a salary. So even just financially looking at a budget, like we were not fully equipped to, we had to make those decisions sooner than we would have liked as the result of her diagnosis. And so at the time I had been working in education. I went and got my master's in divinity and God ordained, but I was always called, at the time, felt like I was called to work in education. So I was working at a Catholic school doing kind of chaplaincy work in New Haven. And then I had taken some time off because I was pregnant and then had twins that same year. And so I was kind of thinking about going back to education, and it was right when she got diagnosed. And so I said that I would take over temporarily. At the time, I thought it was temporary. That was 4 or 5 years ago. And then my two co-pastors, one was already working for the church and did all the children's ministry, but we just elevated her to another co-lead pastor. And then there was another man who was already in our church as well, who's my other co-pastor, who had been a church planter himself, and actually had been an evangelical church planter, and then came out and was gay and left his church, and then was just a member of Riverfront, but working, doing other things too. So ultimately, the search committee decided to call Jen, Ben, who are my two co-pastors, and me to each serve as part-time co-lead pastors of the church. So it's a kind of an unconventional model, and it's different from my mom worked like probably 80 hours a week as the sole pastor prior to getting sick. So transitioning from one person working way too many hours to 3 co-equals working. I mean, we work 18 hours. We're 18 hours apiece. So we kind of share a full-time pastorship. But so it was a transition for the congregation. And it's also like it's an unconventional model. You don't find it a lot, but we absolutely love it. I think there are so many benefits to team leadership in church in terms of accountability. I mean, diversity. One of them is a lesbian woman, one is a gay man, and then me. So we have gender, sexual orientation, diversity, and congregants come to different ones of us for different things. And we hold each other accountable and we bounce ideas off each other. And I just think I'm such a fan of team leadership now in churches.
That is cool. It sounds like you guys have the Trinity working out there at the three.
I'm God, right? Or my Jesus in this scenario.
That's really nice. The co-sharing, that I never heard of it before. To have, I don't think I ever heard of anybody co-sharing, and even 2 people co-sharing, which is
it's done sometimes. There are other churches who have team leadership models. Oftentimes, though, there's one person who is like in charge, who's the lead pastor, and then there's other full-time people on the team. But like it's kind of the buck stops with me at a certain point. But I think that you mentioned like the Trinity, but the Trinity theologically is like a beautiful co-pastorship model and like a beautiful dance between God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. And I think that is modeled again and again in scripture, the idea of power with over power rather than power over, and the idea of, people coming together to make decisions as opposed to authoritarianism. And so I think we model that for our congregation as well in our leadership style. And we're American Baptists, and we have a very congregational polity as well. So we believe in this concept of priesthood of all believers, which is like a fancy way of saying that there's nothing like magical or special about us as clergy just because we were called to this particular profession, that everybody has equal ability to read the scriptures, to pray, to access God on their own. And so I think that shared leadership model also helps to promote that in the church.
Yeah, I appreciate what you said. There's nothing magical about being the leaders. And I don't know much about American Baptists. When I saw that, actually, I gleaned through your website and saw American Baptist. I was like, what's that? Because you just hear Baptist and you
well, we're different than what you think.
Yeah.
The two biggest Baptist denominations in the United States are the Southern Baptist. That's the number one biggest. And then we're second, American Baptist. So we're pretty big as well, but not as big as the Southern Baptist. And the denomination actually split over the issue of slavery and abolition in the mid part of the 1800s. And the Southern Baptists there was a fight over whether missionaries could be slave owners or not. And that was the precipice that split the denomination between the Southern. We were at one point called the Northern Baptists, and they were the Southern Baptists. But to this day, our denomination is about 50% African American and 50% other. And Martin Luther King was a American Baptist, John Lewis. So we have a deep history of that struggle for civil rights and equality for all.
John Lewis. That he just seemed like such an unbelievable person. So he was an American Baptist.
I know. Yeah. Huh. And Martin Luther King's church, Ebenezer Baptist, was American Baptist in Atlanta.
Oh, nice. When you're saying that there's something magical about being pastors, that's kind of the mentality of the American Baptist, is that it's all of us together, or is that just?
Yeah. So it's called. When you look at polity of different denominations, there's something called congregational polity. And that means, of course, an ordination is a special thing, and it's a sacrament, and it's an outward symbol of an inward thing that is happening between you and God in your calling. And I think as ministers, like, we are held to higher standards because we are leaders, and we're helping shepherd people. And God doesn't speak to some people more than others, right? Like, none of us have a lock on hearing from God and from interpreting the Bible. We have certain education and certain skill set that helps us and guides us, that we can help people with, but we're really coming alongside people on their journeys. We're not over them. And there's nothing like different about our relationship with God than anybody's relationship with God. Like, it's egalitarian in that sense. And I think it even connects back to the complementarianism argument we were having before, because, like, in complementarianism, there's an idea that, like, if a man and a woman hear two conflicting things from God, like in a relationship, for example, then the male view trumps the female view, right? Like, so the idea that God would speak differently, or that some of us are more equipped to hear from God than others, to me is just, like, so contrary to what I know about God, and so contrary to, I think, what Jesus uplifted about God in scriptures. So I think you can say the same thing about ordination.
Yeah. When I interviewed and had a conversation really with Julie Mar Ortiz, and I released that last week, and when she'd brought up pastors, and she said, well, they're special people. And I thought, well, not to me. So when she kept
depends on the pastor, and it depends on your experience.
Yeah.
We're all flawed, complex people.
Right.
And some do great damage as well. So it just really depends.
Right. Yeah. And I wondered if that had to do with having a belief in a God, and therefore thinking that they have a straight line, to God, a better communication, like that you were mentioning. So I think it's healthy when the American Baptists, if they have that kind of view of it not being the pastors are the better of the lot, or stronger communication with God. You were talking, I'm wondering, so I guess I have a few questions for the church that your mother had founded. You said it's changed a lot, and it's clearly changed in after your mother has passed, and those who are now leading, yourself, and as well as Jen and Ben. What else has changed in the church? Like, does it have this look the same as when your mom had started it, as far as the outreach or the demographics, or how has it changed, or either matured or shifted?
I think the core values that we hold have not changed. We've kind of always been, I remember my mom used to joke and call our church the island of misfit toys, if you've ever seen the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer version. And we are still that. We are still very much an island of misfit toys, a hodgepodge group of people who, some who have been wounded by the church, some who are just looking for something different. And who the people have changed. I mean, some people have been around since then, and then there's new people, but they're still just like, we're just a weird group of people, and we love that, and we embrace that about ourselves. And it's funny too, because when I lead new membership classes, God will just bring people to our church. And it's like, I feel like my mom is there with me when I lead the classes, because I'm like, I know that she would have just loved some of the people, and people come again and again and again with these stories that so deeply resonate with the story that she had. And so I feel like there's just so the demographics haven't really changed. I mean, the people have changed, but the type of person I think who finds Riverfront hasn't changed a ton. We have always had a huge commitment to children. So we have, our church is not large. We have like probably 75 to 100 adults. We have like 50 children. So like we have close to as many. We have a lot of children at our church, and we really prioritize children. And that's been the case since day one. So we have a special service just for children called Family Time before the adult service, and families worship together. We, our children's pastor is a co-equal to Ben and I, the two adult pastors. Like, she has equal decision-making power because we view children as full members of the body of our church. We try really hard we have a number of adoptive children, special needs children, and children with trauma backgrounds in our church. And we try really hard to provide those kids opportunities to connect to God in ways that they can experience it in a way that suits them. And our children's pastor is amazing. She has a special ed background. She's amazing at that. So those things those aren't new. So that's what hasn't changed. What has changed, so I think that the co-pastor model is really different. As is often the case with church plants, the founding pastor is such a big personality, and her or his personality becomes so much a part of the fabric of the church. And I think in transitioning away from my mom and on to the three of us, we have developed so many more lay leaders. We have really embodied that like full congregational model of all of us being able to be leaders in the church, in our own leadership. And then the other thing that I think we've really been doing work on recently, like in the past 2 years, that's really shifted, is in the past 2 years, we have gotten a lot more engaged in social justice work and advocating for marginalized people in our communities, and doing community organizing, and also doing the really hard work of dismantling racism and examining our own racism. Our church is probably about 80% white, so we have a lot of work to do on that, and how we are with our members of color and with our community. We're located in Hartford, so we are not representative of the community where we're located in. And that was something that just it was a different time, I guess, in 2008. But it was also just something that wasn't as much on my mom's radar, and it wasn't really intentional, explicit work that we ever did prior to the past couple of years. And so that's become one of the really big core values in our church this year, is doing that work on our own, just racial baggage that we all inherit as white people in the United States.
That's something that doesn't get talked about either at all, or it gets like just touched on and then stepped away from. One of the churches that I had talked to you about, that was the one thing that did impress me, is that they stuck with a series on racism. And then I think that some people felt really uncomfortable with a series on that, as if, okay, we can talk about it for 3 minutes, you can mention it. And it happened, the precipice of that was because of George Floyd's murder. And that it was shocking that I then watched everything online to see who was going to talk about it. Some people didn't even mention it, or they mentioned and then talked about the police, that they needed help too. And it's like, that's not what this is about. So having a focus on where we stand, and how we could just feel uncomfortable and just listen, because that's the worst that we're dealing with, is feeling uncomfortable while other people are being,
Yes. We just did a sermon series. We just finished it up like a week or two ago on having hard conversations. And I think as white Christians, that is something we have not historically been good at. And we are not always good at sitting with discomfort and allowing it to be without a resolution. And I think a lot of times in the church, a lot of talk happens around reconciliation, racial reconciliation. And there can be no reconciliation without equity and justice, because reconciliation without justice is just subjugation, right? And so when we skip to, okay, we're all brothers and sisters in Christ, let's reconcile, and we miss all the really hard work of dismantling that needs to happen before. I mean, our denominations are so rooted in white supremacy across the board, like every denomination, like not one is not rooted in white supremacy. And we have to do that work. And it is work and it is hard, but it is holy work, I believe.
How do you see I agree that I think everything is connected to racial
reconciliation or racial justice.
Subjugation. How do you see all the churches having been contributing to that?
So if you look at how our denominations were founded, they were rooted in such like a sense of white supremacy, a sense of like Christian superiority and colonialism. So like I can use the example of the American Baptist Church. Like we were really instrumental in that Liberia movement back in the day when a lot of people were being liberated from slavery, and there was this push to get them to move to Liberia. And a lot of Black people also helped in that movement, but the idea that they couldn't exist in our country, that we were like, we either want you enslaved or we want you out of the country. I mean, all of the air that was being breathed and the water that was being drank at that time was all rooted in that sense of supremacy. I mean, the missionary movement in the American Baptist Church, which was huge in our founding, was rooted in that. Even like when slavery was ending and Black folks were trying to start churches for themselves, they were not able to get paid. They were not able to get health benefits. They were not able to have any like financial support for their churches without linking to a denomination. And oftentimes it would be under a white church. So there was a sense of paternalism within the church that, you know, a person who maybe had a church when they were enslaved and then now they were no longer enslaved and they wanted to have a church. It was like, okay, well, you can have this church if you become this denomination. I mean, we didn't have American Baptist back then, but it was whatever the denomination was, and you can be under this white minister. I mean, it was in everything. It wasn't just like it was in the United States. And that's true of every denomination. I mean, there was segregation in churches. There was all kinds of, and even if you look at like financially, like a lot of our really old churches, the money that they have came on the backs of Black and brown people, which is true across our whole country about everything. Like it was an economic system that benefited white people, and white Christians are still white people. And so as churches, especially the older churches, but I'd include ours in it as well, you know, because we're part of a denomination and we're all people who live in this country. We need to think about that. You know, we need to look at that and look at it with open eyes and be willing to have those hard conversations.
Yeah, that makes me think about when we first started our conversation about women having conversations and saying this isn't right or this isn't okay. And so to have that conversation, that people could feel uncomfortable being white and figuring out what they can do, and not running from the conversation or feeling.
And I think in Christianity, we read the Bible so individualistically, and we think about things in such an individualistic way of like, well, I didn't do anything wrong. Like maybe my grandparents didn't own slaves, or I personally didn't do anything. And we read the Bible in the same way. Like this is a specific thing, like from God to me. And it's not. We're talking about communal sin. We're talking about societal sin. We are talking about like the Bible was written by a community to a community. And so people tend to not want to talk about it or get defensive because they're not thinking about it in a collective way. Not thinking about the systems that are rooted in evil, that are rooted in sin. Sin is so personal and so individual in so many churches. And so people can't develop the resiliency that they need to have these conversations because they take it so personally.
I remember you having that conversation when we talked. We had coffee, and I remember feeling like I wish I was recording this conversation right now.
Now you are.
I'm glad you're saying some of the same things you said, because I forgot that when you were talking about that being like sin being so personal, but it's really bigger than that. And I just want to know if you could talk more about that. And I want to know if that ties in. in our email back and forth to each other, you mentioned decolonizing of our Christianity. Is that part of what you're talking about right now, or is that completely different?
No, that's definitely a part of it. I think when, I mean, I don't know how much you know about like the history of Christianity, but when Constantine, who was the first Roman emperor, converted to Christianity, the whole paradigm of what Christianity was changed. So it went from being a story that was written by and for a marginalized community who was living under an incredibly brutal, violent, and oppressive empire, led by somebody who was a political prisoner and ultimately executed by that empire. It went from that to, about 300 years later, empire. So Christianity became the empire, the state religion, right? When Constantine converted. Mm-hmm. And that just shifted everything. And it's continued to shift ever since. And so I think when we read the Bible and when we take verses and we apply them very literally to our specific lives as Americans living in like the wealthiest country in the world, especially when we apply them individually as opposed to communally, it doesn't read the same way, right? Like, I love the Bible and I have gained so much, and I think that there's so much truth and so much wisdom to be gained from the Bible. But I think when we read it, we need to think about it being intended for a community and how it points towards this collective, beautiful vision of liberation for everybody, as opposed to like, well, it's speaking about this particular sin in my life, whatever that might be. Because what it's really pointing to is this amazing upside down kingdom where the last is first, and children are upheld, women are upheld, lepers are upheld, marginalized people are upheld. And that does very much apply to our current day. Like, it's still so relevant, but the way we read it has to shift, because you have to think about the intended audience, right? Like, there's a lot of voices in the Bible. It's not a single voice. There's a lot of authors, and they all were coming from particular social settings.
I remember in the 1990s that it was, if you're depressed, if you're angry, or if you're this or that, you choose, take the word, and then there would be other verses to look up that exact.
Yeah, it's called a concordance is a book where you can like look up a word or a theme, and it'll tell you everywhere it is in the Bible. But then you also have to keep in mind translation. So like, that's tricky because the Bible was not written in English. And so a lot of times words are translated in a way that wasn't what they meant in the original language. So that's important too.
Yeah. That makes me think of the movie. I think I talked to you about that, the 1946 movie that's coming out, I think next year, but it's changing that homosexuality, that word wasn't even in the Bible until the first version, I think, of the RSV. And it meant sex with male boys, and they changed it to homosexuality being sin. Which get really manipulative when that stuff happens. So decolonizing our Christianity, what does that mean?
So the way that the Bible, I think, is often interpreted in the United States is upholds the empire, right? So there's such a marriage between our governmental systems, our society, our way of life, and Christianity. And Christianity and the Bible and Jesus's words should never be the same as the culture of empire, right? Like, they should be read from the perspective of the most marginalized in our society. And so when we are reading, and there's language in the Bible, like the writers of scripture spoke in a language that people understood and spoke in systems that people understood, like saying the word kingdom, like the word kingdom is talked about a lot in the Bible, or like using slavery as a metaphor, like you're a slave to this, you're a slave to fear, a slave to whatever, saying like Jesus bought you with a price, like that's also slavery metaphor. Like, they used metaphors that people understood, not to reinforce those systems, but to subvert those systems. I think sometimes we read them and think that they somehow uphold this system that benefits, at least like as white Americans, that benefits us greatly. when really the writers of scripture, and most certainly Jesus, were really advocating for the liberation of the most marginalized people in society. And that's why he was killed. Like, the Romans didn't just kill him for kicks, right? Like, they were very threatened. It's a very threatening concept. And he was executed because of that, because of his political, not with like a big P political, like not Republican, Democrat, whatever we think, but small P political, like because of his political views and his desire to have horizontal power as opposed to vertical power. And the Romans were all about the vertical power, like the power over, as opposed to the power with. Jesus is advocating for participation, not adherence. That's why he says, come follow me. Like, we can do this together. It's a really like beautiful vision of what collective community can look like, I think.
That's cool.
I'm going to convert you, Gaia.
I love talking to people of belief because I am intrigued with that. I don't believe that there's a God, but I like visions of. Well, I was just talking to a friend of mine who I'm trying to connect, with Ben Eric, who I became friends with a few years back because I studied having difficult conversations in street epistemology, which is a technique of asking people the epistemology of what they believe and why they believe it, but having Socratic method type conversations where you're not trying to convince the person, but having those kind of open conversations, and usually on tough conversations, whether it's if somebody's an anti-vaxxer or they believe in complementarian or they believe in God, and having these conversations so that it's not about, my God's better than your God, or my not believing God is better than your believing one, or vice versa. It's having the conversation. So yeah, so I like,
and that's really that Jesus really modeled that too. Like, Jesus didn't try to convince people in an argumentative sense. Like, it really was that Socratic conversation. So I think even if you don't believe in a God, like, studying the social movement that was early Christianity is really interesting, just about people. Like, it's interesting just in and of itself as a social movement.
Yeah, I think I have a very good friend of mine who's a Christian, and it's just wonderful to have conversations with him about, well, if you're right, and if there is a God, I don't think that my pushing in to what's truth and not believing in one is going to make me, I don't think that there's well, you're screwed, you tried, but you're screwed, but the rest of us are okay. It's like, I just don't think it could, if it worked like that, it's like, well, and that's the way it goes, but it doesn't seem right.
And that's such a narrow view of God. Like, I think anytime as people, we feel the desire to put God into a box, we should really question where that is coming from.
I think it comes from the I won and you lost mentality.
Yeah. It's human made things, not divine.
Right. But they're not thinking, I mean, it's definitely a pride factor and a winning factor. In order to win, somebody has to lose. And they're not thinking, well, I have the wrong God. You have the right one. They're really thinking I have the right God. And so that person with the different God is thinking I've got the right God.
Right. Of course.
And it's like, all right, well.
Of course. And you know what Jesus says? Jesus said, you will know a tree by its fruits. A good tree does not produce bad fruits, and a bad tree does not produce good fruits. And so it's that fruit test, right? Like, it's not about what you say you believe. It's about the fruits of your life. And that's why, like, being hateful towards the LGBT community, the fruits are awful. When you look at the fruit test, like, the fruits are suicide and mental illness and people leaving the church and broken families and broken relationships. And if you look at gay marriage, the fruits are beautiful for the most part. I mean, there's some bad fruits, just like in heterosexual marriage, because we're all human and being married is hard. But like, there are some beautiful, beautiful fruits that come from that. And so I think, at least for us, like, we have in Riverfront, our first core value is that it's called sola Jesus. So there's this concept in theology called sola scriptura, which is like everything, only the Bible, right? Everything that we believe like comes from scripture. And for us, it's sola Jesus, which means that Jesus is our hermeneutic. So if there is, because the Bible is written by different people and the Bible conflicts itself because they're different authors. And so if there's a question that we are unsure about how to interpret, we always look to Jesus, and that is our test, right? That is our test of what is right. And Jesus said, use the fruit test. Is it producing good fruits or is it producing bad fruits? And there are a lot of atheists who are producing beautiful, beautiful fruits. And I believe that that is of God.
Yeah.
You don't believe that. That's okay. But like, I believe that is of God.
That's a great way of doing that. It's like, what did Jesus say? Because a lot of people have the mentality on, I have a 4-part episode on abortion, because I think that partially gets people to vote in very dangerous ways. And
yeah,
so I feel like it's very important to deconstruct that and pull it down and really figure out what's going on with that. And in my conversation, in my previous recording with Julie Marr, is just how it was almost promoted. If in the Old Testament, if you thought that your wife was having an affair and that's how she was pregnant, you would have her drink a potion. And if she died or if she miscarried, then she was having an affair. But if she didn't, then she wasn't. And if that's in the Bible, and then when you look to what Jesus said about abortion, which was nothing, and the same with homosexuality.
That potion thing isn't in the Bible either. That might be history,
it is.
But that's not in the Bible.
I believe it's in
where?
In Numbers.
Oh, in the old those. Okay,
no,
I thought you meant the New Testament. There's a lot of funky things in Numbers and Deuteronomy.
Yeah. But when somebody is going to vote for a dangerous politician, and the reason being is they want to stack the Supreme Court on abortion, it says something about where you are with your religion.
Well, that's a great example. That's a perfect example of what I was talking about before, is when empire and power intersect with the teachings of Jesus and Christianity. It's never good. Like, that's not what those teachings were meant for. That's not who those teachings were meant for. It was not meant to be a state system. Like, that's just not, it's like transplanting something into a different soil.
Yeah. Good stuff, Liza.
Yeah. Did we check everything off that you wanted to talk about?
I think so. I'm looking at what we talked about, and I definitely want to talk about women. I want to talk about decolonization. I want to talk about your church, where it came and where it's going, where it came, where it is, and where it's going, and where it's going, which we didn't.
Oh, yeah. I was going to just say that one other thing I'll say about women in the church, because I feel like we didn't talk about that a ton, is that when you look at Jesus as our hermeneutic, and we're Christians, so like that's what we're supposed to be doing, right? The word Christian literally means little Jesuses, like little Christs. It was used as like a derogatory term for the early Christians. Oh. Jesus upheld women again and again and again and again. Like, that is clear in the Gospels. The Syrophoenician woman, the hemorrhaging woman, both of them went against social norms to challenge Jesus, right? The Syrophoenician woman spoke out, like out of turn in a super patriarchal society. And he praises her for that and heals her daughter. The hemorrhaging woman who's bleeding, who's in perpetual niddah, which is like the Jewish law when women are bleeding, but she was constantly bleeding, like the period that never ended. She touched Jesus, which would have been against the law, because she would have transferred her uncleanliness to him, and he praises her for that, and he heals her. Mary Magdalene was the first person to witness his resurrection, and that wasn't a coincidence. And the male writers of the Bible had to write about it, probably much to their dismay. It's undisputed, right? So they had to, they were, oh, wow, God chose to appear first to a woman. Paul relied on the financial support of women. Priscilla, Aquila, they were like supporting financially his ministry, and he thanks them. So there's just so much evidence in scripture to point towards the full inclusion of women. And this is like from 2,000 years ago when the social politics and the culture of gender were so far behind what we are today. Even in that day, Jesus intentionally upheld them. He had female disciples, like he had partners in ministry, both Jesus and Paul. So I think there's just a lot of scriptural evidence when we read the Bible to point to a full egalitarian view of women in the church.
I remember, well, I hope we add more over the time, because I'm going to continue to read more about this. I mean, that was one of the reasons why I left the church. I definitely asked a lot of questions as a kid and as a teen and young adult. And then it was really multi-factor, but it was definitely women and LGBTQ. It was just like, this is just ridiculous.
You're not alone. That's why a lot of people leave the church.
Right. Yeah. So it's nice to even, it's refreshing to have a different voices on that subject, because it's so one-sided. Well, and I don't get it.
And I'll say too that like even in a really liberal denomination, and like having served always in contexts that uphold women, and there's still so much sexism in the church. So like this isn't just an evangelical problem or a conservative problem. Like there's patriarchy and inequity in our culture and in all churches. Like from things like women ministers are paid far less than men across the board, like in all denominations. Our outfits are dissected from the pulpit all the time. That's why a lot of us like love to wear robes. That doesn't happen to men. In interviews, I've frequently, and not like to target any one particular church or interview, because this is like a reoccurring thing about my children, about my family, because churches can ask things that corporations can't ask because the private sector can't ask because they're exempt from all of that. So like, asking about who's going to take care of your children or whatever it might be. The tone of voice of my sermons, the tone, my tone, my inflection being criticized. I mean, I could list it all day, the sexism that exists and this isn't like to speak about either of my churches, like just my entire experience in ministry. It's a comprehensive problem that is all, so I don't want, like the evangelicals are more explicit about it. And the complementarianism obviously is a very like overt way of expressing sexism, but like it's rampant in our whole culture and in all churches, in every church I've ever been a part of, even the most liberal. So just to throw a bone for the other side too.
Well, if they are more explicit, and I guess that's not a good thing, but at least when you're seeing it, it's like it's hiding, it sounds like, in the other places. And if you can take the light of what you're seeing, of what's the wrongness of what you're saying, and then really, really apply it everywhere is better than just ganging up, I guess, on the conservative evangelical churches. Yeah, I hear what you're saying.
I remember sense. when I was a chaplain at Hartford Hospital for a year, and when I would go into patients' rooms, they'd be like, "Who are you? We want a priest. You're not a priest." And I'd be like, "I'm a minister." They'd be like, "No, you're not. You're not a minister. You're not an old man." And I was like, okay. I got because it's like when people think of ministers, they think of like the, grandfatherly man with the collar.
What's the percentage of women who are pastors, ministers, priests? What is the percentage, do you think?
I'm sure I don't have that number for you, and I am sure it would widely vary very much based on denomination. I mean, I think among the mainline denominations now, my guess is it would be 50-50, if not even more women. And unfortunately, that's because ministry doesn't pay well and women accept less pay across all sectors. I mean, among the more conservative denominations, they don't ordain women, so it would be 100% male.
Right.
But yeah, I don't have that number for you. We'll have to Google it later.
When you mentioned either of your churches, do you want to talk about how you have two different, that you are a pastor or a minister? What is your, like, what do you call yourself? Are you a pastor or a minister, or what is your title, or what do you call?
People call me Pastor Liza. That's like my title, but I'd say I'm a minister. Yeah, that's my profession. So I serve two churches, half-time at each. Riverfront Family Church in Hartford, which is an American Baptist church. And then the other one, and I'm the co-lead pastor there along with two others. And then I'm the associate minister at Church of Christ Congregational in Newington, which is part of the United Church of Christ. Great.
Maybe we could have I don't know if you could have another conversation at some stage about that as well, if you're interested. And then I am looking forward to visiting you at probably both. And it sounds like the 27th.
Yeah, 27th I'm preaching at Newington, so that would be. But yeah, feel free to come. I can let you know what dates because I'm two Sundays and 2 Sundays. So 27th
Right.
I'll be in Newington, and then at Riverfront in July I'll be there on July 4th and July 18th. Those are my Riverfront Sundays in July. But I can also email you the schedule.
Yeah, because I do it was 52 in 52 weeks, and now it's 52 whenever I get it completed.
However many weeks.
And however many weeks. I didn't foresee the pandemic when I started this in January, but it actually, I don't know how I was going to get through in 2020, how I was going to get through 52 places. I was thinking of just cramming 3 or 4 places in a weekend just so I could take a few weeks off because it wore me out. You're mentally, I don't know how other people feel. Maybe it's, maybe I think people who are not single probably don't feel it as much. And people who probably believe in a God probably don't feel it as much. But but when you're driving up, I am having like an anxiety attack when I get closer. Yeah. And then
no, you're not alone. You have to.
Oh, good.
You're not alone. I think there's like social anxiety in it because it's like you feel like an outsider, and it feels like it's a bunch of insiders, and they're all gonna like flock to you because you're new. Yeah. And you're by yourself, and you don't believe what they believe, and just like the social anxiety of walking into any situation. Like I totally feel that. I'm an introvert actually, even though I appear outgoing. And I feel like I would find, even as a person of faith, I would find it draining to go to a bunch of different churches just because like you're going into a lot of new scenarios where you don't know what you're going to see.
Yeah. Sometimes people are very friendly. Sometimes they're creepy. Sometimes they're unfriendly. It's amazing. It's amazing.
Yeah. So people are people everywhere in the church and outside of.
That's true. That completes my conversation with Liza Arulampalam. I found Liza to be so refreshingly having such an open, new perspectives that I have never heard before. I hope that you enjoyed listening to her as well and had some takeaways from what she shared. I will have links below to Riverfront Family Church if you'd like more information about Liza. I will be attending that church on July 4th or July 18th when she's going to be giving a sermon, and I'll be adding that into my places of worship that I visit. Before I sign off, I want to give you some contact information. If you would like to reach me, you can email me at facethesun2020@gmail.com. You can also leave a message at 860-249-1212. I'll have that information below in the description area. And if you'd like to sponsor the podcast and if you'd like to buy me a cup of coffee, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/Face the Sun. I want to thank you so much for listening to this week's podcast. I will be releasing this on a different day than I normally have been doing just because I want to see when's the best time for listeners to come across my podcast. And I have been researching that apparently Tuesday mornings are the times when a lot of people listen. So hopefully that's a good time for you. And if you have any questions, give me a ring or send me an email. Thanks so much again for listening. And remember to face the sun.